Hi, today we're making this cute bunny wall hanging. To make this wall hanging, you will need assorted spring-colored fabrics and a background fabric. We will be making 8 rabbits for this wall hanging. You can choose 8 different colors for the rabbits, or you can choose as few as 2 different colors for your rabbits. To make each rabbit, you will need a piece of fabric that is 4.5 inches by 9.5 inches, and you will cut one 4.5-inch square for each rabbit. You could also use a charm pack for this project as long as you have 2 squares that are the same color to make one rabbit. Next, you will mark over 2.5 inches and cut a strip that is 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches wide. If your strip was 9.5 inches long, you will have 2.5 inches left over. So for each rabbit, you will need one 4.5-inch square and 2 rectangles that are 4.5 by 2.5 inches long. Continue cutting your fabric until you have 8 4.5-inch squares and 16 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangles. For the front of the wall hanging, you will need 1/3 yard of background fabric. We will be cutting thin strips out of this fabric, and to get accurate cuts, it needs to be wrinkle-free. When you're finished ironing your fabric, you want to lay it out on your mat, fold it and roll edges together like it came on the fabric bolt. We are then going to fold our fabric in half, salvage edges brought up to the fold. We want to make sure that we smooth out any wrinkles that may be in the fabric. And we're going to turn the fabric so that the raw edges are going to be parallel to where we cut. We want to square up our fabric so that we can trim off the raw edge and then continue with our cuts. Once we have trimmed off our raw edge, we are going to move our ruler over and cut a strip that is 2.5 inches wide. We are then going to move our ruler over and cut another strip that is 2.5 inches wide. We are then going to move our ruler over and cut a strip that is 1 3/4 inch wide. We are now going to cut 2 strips that are 2 inches wide. So we should have 2 strips the length of the fabric that are 2.5 inches wide, 1 strip that is 1 3/4 inch wide, and 2 strips that are 2 inches wide. And you'll have 1 strip of scrap material. The 2-inch wide fabric will be used for our border, so we'll set that aside for now. We will start cutting our 2.5-inch strip first. We need to cut 24 2.5-inch squares. You will need to cut 24 2.5-inch squares. I'm cutting through 4 layers of fabric here in the video. You can cut through how many layers you are comfortable with. Continue cutting until you get your 24 squares. Keep the remainder of your 2.5-inch strip because we'll use a piece of it later in the video. We will now move on to cutting the strip that was 1 3/4 of an inch wide. You need to cut 1 3/4 of an inch squares out of this strip, and you will need 8 squares. Now that our background of fabric is cut, we're going to start making our bunnies. To start off with, you will need your 4.5-inch squares and your 1 3/4 squares. We are going to use a quilt method called a stitch and flip for the bunny's chin. To use this method, we will mark a line diagonally across the white squares. We will place a square in one corner of each block. If you are using a fabric with right and wrong sides, you will need to place right sides together. It really doesn't matter which corner of the block you place this white square. Some people like to fold their white blocks in half diagonally and then sew on the fold line. For me, this doesn't work because I really can't see the fold line under my sewing machine. If you've used this method before, do it however you feel comfortable. We will be sewing one white block onto one colored block diagonally. Once we have all of our white blocks marked and placed onto our background fabric, we will take it over to the sewing machine and we will sew on the diagonal line. To check your corners to see if they've turned out, you want to see that you've sewn on the diagonal line and that when you fold the white fabric down, it doesn't exceed past your colored fabric. With this stitch and flip method, you want your block, when the piece that you've sewn on is flipped down, to be the same size as it started at. So we have a 4.5-inch block that we started with. We still want our square to be 4.5 inches wide and square on the corners when we flip this white area out. So from here we want to get rid of the extra fabric in this corner. We don't need 3 layers of fabric here, so we're going to cut that off. We are going to open up our seam allowance and we're going to iron all seam allowances opened. For this project, we are going to iron open all seam allowances. Now we're going to move on to the bunny's ears. We are going to use those 2.5-inch squares, but we're going to set 8 squares aside for later. We will use the same stitch and flip method that we used on the bunny's heads. We will mark a line diagonally on our white squares that we'll sew on. The only difference with the bunny's ears are that we have a right and left ear, and the diagonal actually has to be going in the right direction to have 2 different ears. For each of your rabbits, you are going to need a right and left ear, and it's easiest to do this if you lay them out and make sure you have 2 different angles going for the ears. For me, it's best to lay all these ears out so that I know that the diagonals are going in opposite directions, and then I can stack them and take them to the sewing machine. You cannot just sew all of them the same way and then spin the block around. The diagonal will not be going in the right direction. Now that we have them marked and laid out, we'll take them over to the sewing machine and we'll sew on the line we drew. Once you've sewn all of your white blocks on, check them to see if they line up properly. Double check to make sure you have a right and a left rabbit ear and that the diagonals are going in the opposite direction, and cut off your excess fabric. Once you've cut off the extra fabric on your bunny ears, you'll want to iron the seams open. These two rabbit ears are going in the same direction. And these two rabbit ears are going in opposite directions, so I have a right and a left ear here. We need to lay out our rabbit so we can start sewing it together. The rabbit has a right ear and a left ear, and then we're going to put a 2.5-inch square in the corner. To get this ready for sewing, I'm going to fold the 2.5-inch square right sides together onto the right ear, and then I'm going to put the left ear on top of the face, lining up the edges, and I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and do a 1/4-inch seam down the side. We're going to fold open our rabbit and we're going to take it to the iron and press our seams open. Once you've ironed your rabbit and the ear, you'll want to put the right ear down onto the rabbit and the left ear. You're going to pay attention to this intersection and line up the seam right here where your white block, corner block is. Once you have this intersection pinned or clipped, you'll want to take it to the sewing machine and do a 1/4-inch seam. You'll want to check your rabbits to see if your intersections are lining up. You will want to open up your seam allowances and iron them. Once you have completed all 8 rabbits, you'll want to lay them out so that you can sew them together. When laying 4 rabbits out, you'll want their chins to come together. The little stitch and flip triangle that we did will come together in the center of the block of 4 rabbits. This arrangement creates a secondary pattern of triangles on the diagonal. You'll lay out your next 4 rabbits in the same way, with their chins coming to the center, that little stitch and flip triangle coming to the center of the block. Once you have your bunnies arranged in the order that you want them in, we'll start sewing them together. You'll place your bunnies right sides together, so you'll sew this center seam. You will be sewing a couple of seams when you sew these bunnies together, and it's important to line them up. When you take these to the sewing machine, you'll be doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you want to try to keep the seams open. Once you've sewn them together, we want to open up the seam allowance and press it open. We'll put our bunnies together horizontally, we'll line up our seams, and we'll do a 1/4 inch seam again. Now we'll sew our 2 sets of 4 bunnies together, lining up our seams. We'll use that 2-inch border fabric that we set aside earlier, and we'll sew that on with a 1/4 inch seam. We will trim the edges of our border fabric, and we'll iron the seams towards the border, towards the outside, and then we'll sew on the top and bottom borders. You will need a piece of fabric for the back of your panel, and it will need to be about 17 by 30 inches. If you like to free motion quilt and you need a little more fabric to hold on to, you can definitely make this back fabric larger. You will need a piece of batting about the same size as the fabric you're using on the back of the quilt. You will want to smooth out your batting. We'll place our bunny fabric on top of this and make a quilt sandwich. We'll smooth out the wrinkles and we'll iron it so that it sticks together. If you would like, you could pin this together or you could use a spray adhesive. I did not. I used 4 safety pins. I put 1 in each corner and it stayed together. Once you've ironed it nice and flat and got out the wrinkles, you want to take it to the sewing machine and do some top stitching. Whatever you do is your choice. You can do some straight line quilting, you can do some free motion quilting, whatever you like. For this quilt, I did straight line stitching with a walking foot, and I only sewed in the background fabric. Once you have finished quilting your bunnies, you'll want to trim your panel down and prepare a binding. For this quilt, I bought a fat 1/4 of fabric and I cut 2.5 inch strips. I folded them in half, ironed them, and used them as my binding. You can also purchase ready-made binding. For a small quilt like this, it's not very expensive. When you go with a large quilt, it could be very expensive to use ready-made binding. At the top of the panel, I placed some fabric to use as a pocket for a rod. I made a 2.5 inch square out of that 2.5 inch fabric we had cut earlier, and I folded it in half diagonally. I sewed it into the seam allowance when I put the back binding on to make a rod pocket. To finish up the quilt, you need to give your bunnies eyes and whiskers. You can use any materials that you have on hand to do this. I thought about using buttons, and then I decided I liked googly eyes better, and I used embroidery floss to do the whiskers. Hopefully you try this technique. Please comment, like, and subscribe. Thank you very much.